You wake in a crowded camp. The ground beneath your bedroll is damp from last night's rain, and the first grey light barely touches the canvas overhead. Then the wind shifts. A sour, unmistakable smell crawls through the tents, something between rot and ammonia, thick enough to coat your throat. Someone made one careless choice in the dark, and now the entire camp is paying for it. This scene repeated itself countless times across human history, from military encampments stretching across ancient plains to pilgrim way stations packed with travelers during sacred festivals. Here's the question that should unsettle you. If people didn't understand germs, had no microscopes, no bacterial theory, no modern medicine, how did some camps stay surprisingly healthy for months, while others collapsed into sickness, dysentery, and death after only a few weeks? The answer isn't what you might expect. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't ignorance surviving by accident. Something else was happening, and the deeper you look, the more sophisticated and sometimes brutal the solutions become. The core problem was deceptively simple but ruthlessly punishing. When human beings concentrate in one location, waste accumulates at a rate that outpaces any natural process of decomposition or dispersal. A single person produces significant solid waste daily, and in a camp of several hundred or several thousand, the mathematics become terrifying within days. But the danger wasn't just volume, it was connection. Contamination doesn't stay where you leave it. It spreads through hands that touch food, through flies that land on both waste and cooking pots, through footwear that tracks invisible residue across sleeping areas, through rainfall that carries material downhill into streams where people collect drinking water. Ancient peoples didn't have the vocabulary of pathogens or fecal-oral transmission, but they had something nearly as powerful: pattern recognition built across generations. They noticed that camps near certain water sources got sick. They noticed that sickness seemed to follow flies, bad smells, and proximity to filth. They didn't know why, exactly, but they knew what, and they passed that knowledge down through stories, rules, and camp traditions that outlasted individual lifetimes. The first principle emerging across cultures and contexts is separation. Camps that lasted, whether Roman legions on campaign, nomadic herders wintering in a valley, merchant caravans at crowded crossroads, or hunting bands occupying seasonal sites, learned to draw invisible but absolute lines. Waste areas had to be physically removed from sleeping quarters, cooking fires, food storage, and above all from water collection points. This sounds obvious until you consider the pressures working against it. Darkness, cold weather, illness that makes walking difficult, overcrowding during storms or sieges, and simple human laziness at 3 in the morning when the latrine trench is 200 paces away. The separation had to be enforced, not just encouraged. In organized military camps, we find evidence of designated zones sometimes marked by stakes, ropes, or known boundaries. Roman sources reference latrines positioned at the camp's edge, downwind and downstream from living quarters. The logic wasn't always stated explicitly, but consistency across different periods and cultures suggests accumulated experience. Keep the bad air and contaminated water away from where people eat and sleep. But here's the catch. Separation only worked if everyone followed it. One soldier relieving himself beside the grain supply, one child wandering to the wrong spot at night, and the system began to fail. Camp geometry mattered more than most people realize, and the smartest camps thought carefully about topography before anyone pitched a tent. Downwind positioning for latrine areas reduced the constant assault of odor, which wasn't just about comfort, it was about compliance. If latrines smelled too strongly from the living quarters, people would avoid using them and find closer, more dangerous spots. Downhill positioning was even more critical. Waste moves with water, and rain falling on contaminated ground carries contamination wherever it flows. If the latrine area sat uphill from the water source, every storm became an outbreak waiting to happen. Experienced camps learned this lesson the hard way, because the practice of siting latrines carefully appears in multiple independent traditions. Travelers' accounts from medieval caravansaries note facilities placed away from wells. Archaeological reconstructions of large Native American seasonal camps show separation patterns consistent with waste management awareness. Roman military camps followed geometric templates, placing latrines at specific positions relative to command tents, cooking areas, and gates. None of these peoples shared a scientific theory, yet they converged on remarkably similar solutions because the alternative was watching people die. Latrines took various forms depending on materials, camp duration, and culture, but the underlying concept was always containment. Trenches were common in military contexts, long, narrow ditches that concentrated waste in controlled areas. Pits served similar functions in longer-term camps, dug deep enough to create meaningful distance between waste and surface. Some groups used designated zones without physical structures, specific areas of the camp perimeter that everyone understood to be the only acceptable locations, enforced by custom rather than construction. The key wasn't the technology, it was the rule. A camp with a trench that people ignored was worse off than a camp with a simple boundary that people respected. Here is where covering enters the picture, and this practice was nearly universal among successful camps. Almost everywhere we look, waste management included something placed over fresh deposits, earth, sand, ash from fires, plant debris, or whatever material was locally abundant. Covering reduced smell dramatically, keeping the area tolerable enough for continued use. Covering also discouraged flies, and while ancient peoples didn't understand that flies carried disease organisms on their legs and mouthparts, they certainly understood that flies around waste meant flies in the food. Ash may have had accidental antiseptic properties, though users wouldn't have framed it that way. The point was practical: cover the waste, reduce the stench, keep flies down, and the camp stays healthier. Rivers and flowing water presented a seductive trap that destroyed camps who trusted them too completely. The logic seemed sound. Water moves, so waste deposited in a river would simply wash away, carrying the problem downstream and out of mind. In some circumstances, with low population density and fast-moving water, this might have been marginally less dangerous. But in crowded camps, or along rivers where multiple groups shared the same watercourse, the illusion collapsed catastrophically. Consider a caravan route following a river through arid terrain, where dozens of camps might occupy the same banks over a single season. Each camp thought they were disposing of waste responsibly, letting the current carry it away, but the current carried it directly to the next camp downstream, and the next. Sickness would ripple down the river, and people blamed bad air, bad luck, or divine punishment, never suspecting the water they drank. Worse, even camps that tried to draw drinking water upstream and deposit waste downstream often failed to account for eddies, backflows, floods that raised water levels, or groundwater infiltration in wetland areas. The lesson that some groups eventually learned was brutal but simple. Flowing water isn't a toilet. If you must use water at all, the separation between drinking source and waste disposal must be extreme, measured in significant distance, and protected by constant vigilance. Social enforcement was the invisible architecture holding all these physical systems together, and its importance cannot be overstated. In small bands, hunter-gatherer groups, small trading parties, extended families on migration enforcement might be informal but effective. Everyone knew everyone, and the shame of fouling the camp fell directly on identifiable individuals. A person who endangered the group's health could be confronted, ostracized, or forced to make amends. In larger organized groups, especially military forces, enforcement required formal structure. We have fragmentary evidence of sentries posted at latrine areas, not to guard against enemies but to ensure proper use. There are references to assigned duties, specific individuals responsible for digging new trenches, covering old ones, maintaining boundaries between zones. Some military codes included punishments for soldiers relieving themselves in unauthorized locations, treating it not as a minor inconvenience, but as a serious disciplinary infraction on par with other breaches of order. This severity makes sense when you understand the stakes. One negligent individual could start a chain of contamination that killed dozens. Hygiene in concentrated populations was never an individual preference. It was a community survival problem, and communities that failed to treat it seriously paid with mass graves. Waste handling was labor, and this is perhaps the least romantic but most honest truth about ancient camp sanitation. Latrines did not maintain themselves. Trenches filled up and needed to be covered over while new ones were dug. Pits reached capacity. Designated areas became too contaminated for continued use. The work of digging, moving, covering, relocating, and rotating sites was constant, unglamorous, and exhausting. In military camps, this labor was often assigned to the lowest ranks or to enslaved workers, creating hierarchies around waste. In smaller groups, the work might rotate or fall on specific individuals by established custom. Mobility itself became a sanitation strategy for many nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples. When waste accumulated past tolerable levels, the solution was simple: leave. Move the camp to fresh ground and let time, weather, and natural decomposition slowly reclaim the old site. This worked brilliantly for groups with the freedom to relocate, but it was impossible for siege camps, winter encampments in harsh climates, or fixed waypoints along trade routes that had to serve multiple groups. Those camps needed infrastructure, labor, and iron discipline, or they faced the consequences. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this reality. Soil analysis at long-occupied sites sometimes reveals layered latrine deposits with distinct covering strata, suggesting periodic maintenance over extended periods. We should be honest about limits, because not every camp succeeded, and even successful ones lived on the edge of failure. Outbreaks happened. Dysentery killed armies that were winning their wars. Pilgrim camps buried hundreds before festivals ended. Trading posts had to be abandoned after sickness swept through. The systems we've described were fragile, dependent on leadership that enforced rules, weather that cooperated, supplies that held out, and populations that didn't exceed what local environments could absorb. One storm flooding a latrine trench into the drinking water supply could undo months of careful discipline. One overcrowded stop when newcomers didn't know the rules could start a contamination chain. One broken enforcement regime, a commander who didn't care, a social structure disrupted by conflict, could turn a healthy camp into a death trap within weeks. What protected camps was never one clever trick or single innovation. It was a system, an interlocking set of practices involving camp layout, water discipline, waste rules, covering routines, constant labor, and ruthless enforcement. Miss any element, and the system weakened. Miss several, and the camp died, leaving only silence and abandoned ground. When we step back and see the full picture, what emerges is something far more impressive than primitive people getting lucky. These were survival engineers operating without theory, building from observation, enforcing from necessity, and achieving results that modern epidemiology can explain retroactively. What we call bathroom management was not a minor comfort issue for ancient camps. It was logistics at its most fundamental, the mathematics of inputs, outputs, and spatial relationships. It was discipline at its most unforgiving, the understanding that individual choices in the dark could kill entire communities by daylight. It was survival engineering at its most invisible, systems that work so well when followed that people never noticed them, and that failed so catastrophically when broken that survivors never forgot the lessons. The smell crawling through those tents in our opening scene wasn't just unpleasant, it was a warning signal written in chemistry that humans learned to read long before they understood the language. The camps that listened to that signal, that built their layouts and rules and labor systems around it, survived long enough to leave descendants, records, and archaeological traces. The camps that ignored it vanished into the silence between history's lines, remembered only as cautionary tales told around fires by people who knew, even without microscopes, that what you do in the dark follows you into daylight.